Hello, this is Lloyd Crooks here, and what I'm going to talk about is terms of the rules that affect modern textual criticism and how it actually affects what goes into modern Bibles or not. All right. So basically, there was a man called Johann Jakob Griesbach. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But what happened is that he was basically the grandfather of modern textual criticism. A lot of his rules that he 15 rules affect textual criticism what goes into our Bible today in terms of our New Testament. So basically, in the introduction to his second edition of the Greek New Testament, 1776, he set out a list of critical rules, such as the shorter canon, the harder reading, the harsher reading, and these basically ended up in the textual commentary of Bruce Metzger and also Greek New Testament. So if you see them, he doesn't actually mention Greece, but they came from him. Yeah. So so these are things how they're used to evaluate what goes into the Bible, and as a consequence, to the Greek New Testament, as a consequence, they translated. So let's move on swiftly. So the shorter reading, all right. So basically, what the rule is, if not wholly lacking the support of old and weighty witness, to be preferred over the more verbose. Now, the point I want to bring out here: for scribes were much more prone to add than omit. So here's the point: he's stating that scribes were much more prone to add than to omit. They hardly ever leave out anything on purpose, but they added much. This is what he's saying about scribes. It's true indeed that some things fell out by accident, but likewise not a few things allowed in by the scribes through errors of the eye, ear, memory, imagination, and judgment have been added to text. The shortering, even if by support of the witnesses, it may be the second best, especially preferable. So he's making a statement about what scribes would do and what they wouldn't do. So basically, this gives you how it affects modern Bible translation. So what you see here is the textual commentary. So what the textual Bruce Metzger's textual commentary, what it does, it goes through the committee's decision about what variants and the grading of each variant that goes into the United Bible Society. So the Greek Textual Bible Society, they have A, B, C, and D. What the committee thought was certain or virtually certain and so forth. So, and this was a note to the translators. So the translators of for example, the English Standard Version would translate from the United Bible Society Greek New Testament, and they look at these ratings over variants. Yeah. So, but the textual commentary would tell you why they put things in, and a lot of times they would use in terms of, for example, the shorter reading. So I'll give an example of the shorter reading. Matthew 8, verse 25. It's a B rating, and he gives us his reasons why. Sometimes even reading the reason, I think, you know, anyway, you can read that for yourself. So how does that translate to English? In English Standard Version, and they went and woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." And that's United Matthew 8:25, United Bible Society 5. It would seem, depending where you stand, what I understand, that if you're a Montex critic, you say that "and his disciples" was added. If you're majority text, King James, text receptors, you would say this was missing. So this is where they go for the shorter reading. This example where they give for the shorter reading. And there's many other examples I could have given you for where the committee decided on the shorter reading based on the rules given. Yeah. So is the shorter reading a fact? Yeah. So I said this, the shorter reading has influenced textual decisions on variants up to today, and this was instigated in 1776. And the actual rules favored the early manuscripts, the Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, and they were a lot shorter than later Byzantine manuscripts. So they were classed as corrupt because they believed that the purest form was found in Vaticanus. And if you look in your modern Greek New Testaments, they follow primarily as Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. The papyri are only used when they support Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. So what you'll find when you look in terms of the Greek New Testament, you won't find, all right, we're going to follow this early papyri. It's only when that papyri supports Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. Yeah. So the question comes in: how did these canons arise? What studies on scribes have been come to establish these canons? So you'd expect that if you say you're shorter reading, expect some studies would have gone into studying what scribes did, looking at the evidence itself. So this is Bruce Metzger's comment in Bruce Metzger's commentary. In general, the shorter readings to be preferred, except where, and he gives the exceptions. But the point I want to bring out here, if you look on B, it says the scribe may have omitted a material that would be deemed superfluous, harsh, or contrary to pious belief. Since scribes would frequently bring divergent passages into harmony with one another in parallel passages, yeah? And it says scribes would sometimes replace an unfamiliar word with a more familiar synonym, yeah? And add pronouns, conjunctive speech to make a smoother text, yeah? So basically, in a nutshell, they're saying that scribes are more likely to add than omit. And in a sense, these all worked against the Byzantine manuscripts. But the issue here is that what evidence caused modern textual critics to arrive at this particular rule or canon? What was the evidence? So how does it affect? So in the Greek New Testament, we talk about Scribner, which is a text receptus, and we've got Stephanus. Very little difference between the Scrivener's edition and Stephanus. But if you compare it with the Nestor's Land 27, we're talking about 2,000 words, 2,500 words, roughly difference. 2,500 words, yeah? All right. So the first person to do scribal habits is Ernest Cowell, Cadman Cowell. And he looked at three papyri, P45, P66, P75, which is the main papyri which are used in the critical editions. And he was the first one to do study the scribal habits. But what he did, his methodology was focus on singular readings. That's readings in these papyri that were not found in any other manuscript. And as a consequence, they would say that these singular readings were peculiar to that particular scribe. If you gather what I'm saying. So where he was really important, it wasn't taken on board by modern scholars because it's only three papyri, and he didn't come to any real conclusions as to what scribes would do or wouldn't do. But what happened was it was really taken on by James Royce, and this one was like a real explosion. And it's a great, brilliant book, right? I think this is his doctoral dissertation, and he built on Cadell's work, and he used 6 papyri, yeah, and he focused on singular readings. But this would what he studied, and Cadman, he seemed to go into more detail in terms of the results. So let's see what he says, and this is, I think, it's in the first chapter. He said one of the most detailed states of the canons, and he said most detailed and influential states of the canons of Textual has been of Griesbach. If we look at, say, his first canon, that's the shorter readings to be preferred, we will gain the impression that Griesbach had wide-ranging knowledge of documents necessary to delineate precisely when scribes were like to add and when, as exceptions, they were likely to omit. We may, of course, be sure that Griesbach did have such knowledge and may well regard his distillation of this knowledge into various rules as having sound authority. Now, really, what he's saying is we can assume that he knew what he was doing when he produced this particular canon. Nevertheless, it is significant that no specific reading of a manuscript is cited as a foundation for this first canon, and in fact, no specific reading of a manuscript is cited anywhere within Griesbach's Prolegomena. So what he's saying is that he may have done it, but we've got no evidence because he didn't refer to any manuscripts or any methodology of how he arrived at that. And this is what we're looking at, is what methodology did he use to arrive at the shorter reading canon. So, and I know it caused a lot of controversy. It seemed to cause a lot of controversy because it was basically, anyway, we'll go into this later, yeah? I'm getting ahead of us. The fact that Griesbach doesn't even attempt to present evidence for his statement about how scribes copied makes it difficult, if not impossible, for later students to know exactly he would have considered as evidence. To check the evidence upon which his statements rest, or to revise his statements in the light of the new evidence provided by subsequent manuscripts discovery. So basically, he doesn't even attempt to present it, but nobody picks up and says, "Hold on, we're saying what scribes would do, what they wouldn't do," but no scribal study to scribal habits really happened until the 60s. But here's sometimes the problem is where certain scholars will just take information without quickly examining it. And it's a sort of a denial of critical thinking as to how did you arrive at that? Sometimes, where you ask somebody, they come to you with something. I say, well, how did you come to that conclusion? And nobody even questioned this or seemed to question it. But I really appreciate Canon Cowell, Ernest Cowell, and James Royce. Brilliant, brilliant. But really, scholars didn't really move away from the short canon or even question the short canon because they said, okay, Cowell did 3 papyri, Royce did 6 papyri. But where Royce is so influential was a number of scholars using that methodology, jumped them back and looked at not just papyri, but codices, minuscules, and even lectionaries, using the principle of singular readings. So here's from Andrew Wilson, and his one's brilliant. You can get it off the internet, and he compares with the different studies. So James Royce, with papyri, 71% to 29%. 71% scribes omitted, as opposed to 29% adding. Maurice Robertson, his doctoral dissertation on singular readings, he looked at majuscules, and he had a 62% to 38% on majuscules. When it came to minuscules, he had a 60-40% split, where scribes omitted more than they added. Peter Head, looking at papyri, he did 66% to 34%. Juan Hernandez, who did his doctoral dissertation, I believe it was doctoral dissertation, I could be wrong, but he did a study on the Book of Revelation, the Apocalypse, and he used the major codices at the time, the majuscules, and he came up with a 60-40. So you notice the similarities with the split, especially with Hernandez and Robinson. Andrew Wilson, he did more extensive one, using quite a number of variants. So he looks across the board. His one's very detailed because he looks at all the canons. And you have a 75-25 split for the papyri, 40-60 with the majuscules. So you see a similar pattern. 38-62 with the minuscules, and even lectionaries 69 to 31%. So every one of these studies based on singular readings said scribes were more likely to omit than add. So the canon is that scribes added, therefore we should have a shorter reading. Okay. So every scribal study using singular readings have found that scribes were more likely to omit rather than add. So it's reversed that canon on its head. This one's brilliant. I forgot how I got hold of this. Alan Taylor Farr studied at Birmingham University, which is the university up about 40 minutes away from where I am. And his method was different from James Royce. He used an exemplar. He had to use sort of later manuscripts exemplar, and he looked at the exemplar, looked at that particular manuscript, and then looked at what manuscripts were copied by that. And he could identify by looking at the original what was being copied, which is called the exemplar, and the copies coming out of that. So it's like virtually looking over the shoulder of the scribe to see what mistakes they made. What did they add? What did they omit? Yeah. And use a number of minuscules. And one of the results was follows and this is what he says. And I've frequently repeated this. It's because following Royce's statement, some scribes behaved one way, other scribes behaved in another way, which is a fair point. Scribes may act differently. But one common thread among our scribes is that none of them added words on the whole. And that seems to be the only conclusion common to all of our scribes. They didn't add. the next point is, sorry about that, I jumped ahead here. Um, so what we find here is that Moses Silva, he's defending it. It's of course true that if we all say that is that the shorter reading is to be preferred, it's patently untrue in numerous cases, as Royce has other shown. Yeah. So so Royce, Hernandez, Head, I think even Moses Silva did one on the shorter reading. But look what he says. Despite the evidence and no evidence to the contrary, he said, I think it's slander on our text critical forefathers to even suggest that they had such a naive understanding of the facts, considering that Griesbach's classical formulation of this canon is readily accessible in English. That doesn't mean anything. Because you can read it in English doesn't mean, it doesn't tell us how he got to that. He didn't tell us about his methodology of how he arrived at that conclusion. So, for example, if like I live in Birmingham currently, but I'm from London, and it's like I appear in London. How did I get there? I can get there by train. I can get there by coach. I can drive there. I can get there by plane. And then there's different ways I can go there. Well, tell us how you got there. And even though Moyes is defending this rule, he provides no evidence. Like in the court of public opinion or the court of in court, you have two presentations. You have presentation um, saying this person is guilty, evidence that we found this person, we believe this person is guilty, and people to defend. But he provides no evidence to defend the shorter readings to be preferred, except he quotes from Metzger's book, The Text of the New Testament, the same thing, that the shorter readings to be preferred. That doesn't make sense. So, it's a struggle to see people defending things, yeah, when you have no evidence to support the facts. Anyway, going back to Alan Taylor Farnes, he made another good point. Because what he did in his study, he did two studies. In fact, I'm probably oversimplifying. He did one where you have the exemplar of the manuscript and you have the copies, and it's probably the best way you can actually compare exactly what the person is copying. But he also used singular reading with P20 Papyri 127. And so he could actually compare with Royce's findings because with P27 he used singular readings, so he could actually compare with James Royce's findings. But he says something that really grabbed out at me and stirs things up in me. He said P27 exhibits a free text in the extreme, but it's notable that P127's text did not win out. It is notable that the free expressions as found in P127 and 05 are not carried on. These manuscripts have such a high number of singular readings because no other manuscript copied them. They did not win. These texts are losers. It's quite strong words there. The fact that one scribe, patron, or reader created such an aberrant text means nothing for the overall transmission of the New Testament. That these readings were not carried on is actually further evidence of the strict transmission of the New Testament. P127's text was identified, shackled, and left no offspring. Let me say that one again. Further evidence of strict transmission of the New Testament P127 text was identified, shackled, and left no offspring. This is a witness of strict and accurate transmission history. Now, the reason why this is really important is that this is the same argument for Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and these papyri. Why isn't that any of these Alexandrian texts found to be an exemplar from which copies were made? So if you look at this, and it's easily proven, if you look at Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Sinaiticus was found in St. Catherine's Monastery, and it was about to be burned. The question is, such an old manuscript, why can't we find copies of that manuscript? You see, Alan Taylor Farnes mentions that P127 text was identified. You could put Codex Vaticanus there. instead of P127, to put Codex Sinaiticus there, shackled and left no offspring. There's no offspring, no copies. No, it's not using the exemplar. That shows you how little value that the scribes going back 1,000 years, but modern scholars all of a sudden see, wow, this is great and valuable. We're going to change our Greek manuscripts and print a Greek New Testament for this. But yet, people who lived in that time didn't seek to copy it. Didn't seek to copy it at all. For if you look for 1,700 years, you can't find a copy where these manuscripts are used as an exemplar. That's something to think about. Anyway, let's see what other scholars are saying. Yeah. Barbara Land. Now, when James Royce wrote this, he got a lot of criticism for this. Is that an example of versus Barbara Land's assessment that canons of criticism should not be altered? Now, can I say something here? Kurt, Barbara Land, Bruce Metzger, at the time, they've all passed away now. But you can't build your whole career and find out it's a lie or it's not true. I should say lie. That's found with no evidence. The question is, right, in the previous comments, I did not go into the criteria that lead in each particular case to a decision about the original reading. But since they, of course, have not changed and will not change, rather, old school rules of classic philology are to be applied, which must be observed by anyone who produces a text. These rules have often been presented by various authors in the appropriate hands. To be sure, in this area, one can dispute the details of specific formulations or different points, but not the kernel of the rules themselves. Now, listen, the problem when you've built your whole career on unsubstantiated rules, it's very difficult to walk back from that. It's difficult to walk back from that. In fact, how she criticized James Royce, she said, you should have compared the manuscripts to the Nestor's Land. Well, the Nestor's Land already tells you they use a shorter reading, so we'll agree. So what you find here is that refusing to change, despite the evidence. No evidence. It's one thing for me to disagree with somebody. If somebody presents me with evidence and I've got no evidence to support my case, I can't argue with that individual. My dad used to say to me, never argue about things you don't know. Well, Kurt and Barbara and Alan seen as top scholars, but they did not, and Bruce Metzger, and your Bart Ehrmans, and so forth, and your Moises Silva. But where's your contradictory evidence? If you look at a court, you have two sides, but you have to present your side, evidence for your side, and none has been forthcoming. All it is to say, well, we've been doing this for years, let's carry on. And it's the same criticism people use against the text of Researchers. Yeah. Edward Hobbs, this is actually from an email. Someone put an anonymous email up saying, actually, due to the work of Cowell, Clark, Streeter, Royce, and Head, it's been shown that due to various factors, scribes are more likely to omit than add to the text. All right, so we don't know who wrote that, but here's what Edward Hobbs said. Remember I said, if you are going to disagree with somebody, provide the evidence, bring the receipts. Listen to what he says. A real scholarly rebuttal to that email. This statement is nonsense. Cowell was my teacher. Clark was my friend. Royce was my student. I was on the dissertation committee, one of three, and the only textual critics. And Streeter's writings on this subject were my bread and butter, long before I took my PhD, almost half a century ago. The only one of them who argued that scribes tend to add rather than omit was my student, Jim Royce, who overgeneralized the results of extremely limited study with a few papyri. Let me pause here for a moment. Where's your evidence? Edward Hobbs has not provided evidence to the contrary that contradicts James Royce. But he said a limited study of a few papyri. Now, I've already shown you that they looked at lectionaries, they looked at magistrals, they looked at minuscules. Whatever you want to look at, studies been done on them. And in fact, you look at Alan Taylor Farnes, he's actually looked at an exemplar and looked at copies. But here's the point. These modern textual scholars like Hobbes, the Alans, the Metzgers, the Silvers, They're not providing contrary evidence to say this is not true because we've got this evidence. All they're just saying is, look who I know. This statement is nonsense. Cowell was my teacher. Clark was my friend. Royce was my student. I was on his dissertation committee. One free and the only text critic and street's writings on the subject were my bread and butter. Long before I took my picture, almost a half a century. The only one who argued that scribes tend to add rather than omit was my student Jim Royce. Shame on you, Mr. Hobbes. I have to say, shame on you. Bring the evidence. You're supposed to be a scholar. Bring evidence. All right? Now, look what he said. If several dozen more dissertations on this issue, several dozen, studying some young uncials above all post 300 CE uncicles, which show the same, we'd have to rethink the question. Well, Edward Hobbes, Juan Hernandez, Maurice Robinson, Andrew Wilson, Peter did the Papri. But you've got your evidence, now you have to rethink. But they won't. Dan Wallace. There are numerous guidelines under the broad umbrella of choosing the reading that best explains the rise of the others, but two stand out: the short readings to be preferred and the hard readings to be preferred. Which justifies a preference for the shorter reading, the assertion. Scribes had a strong tendency to add words or phrases rather than omit, but it qualifies a statement as long as an unintentional omission is not likely, that shorter reading is preferred. Now, that's for a top scholar, that is foolishness. How do you know whether it's intentional or unintentional? Unless you got into a time machine, went back into the time when these guys were writing this. How do you know it's unintentional? Whether it's unintentional or intentional, it's irrelevant. Yeah? All right? You don't know whether it's intentional or unintentional. Terrible. 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 Um, David Parker, I think it's Birmingham University. One of the book's conclusions was like, namely, a challenge to the traditional textual canon that shorter reading is to be preferred. Royce amply demonstrates something which is true of many, perhaps many manuscripts, namely that scribes tend to shorten their manuscript they were copying. That being the case, he argues that one needs to hedge around lectio brevio with caveats, but does this evidence really overturn one of the longest held editorial principles? I do not think so. But to be fair, this may have been before Maurice Robinson's doctoral dissertation, Juan Hernandez's dissertation, Peter Head, Moses Silver, he did one as well. I think Dirk Jonke did one as well. And they've all come with the same conclusion. Scribes, more likely. Alan Taylor Farnes. They all came with the same conclusions. We've got two different methodologies, one with singular readings, one using exemplar and copy, and they all say the same thing. So what I would say is it'd be interesting to see whether modern textbooks, which I don't think they're going to change anyway. But the question is, modern textbook critics will still hold on despite not having any evidence to the contrary. So the questions for modern textbook criticisms. Modern Bibles have been underpinned by Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. The big question is, to all the modern scholars, your Moses Silver, your Bart Ehrman, your Eldon J. all you scholars, why was not one copy made of Codex Vaticanus in the Vatican Library anywhere? Why cannot you show that Vaticanus was used as an exemplar? Why is there no copies of Codex Sinaiticus of St. Catherine's Monastery? Why isn't we have these two major codexes which we've thrown aside the Byzantine manuscripts, which were better copied on the side, but you cannot find them using exemplar? Why? Why have one scholars jumped on the train and says, right, we're going to throw everything out because we've got Sinaiticus Vaticanus? But the question is, why can't you find copies of these two great manuscripts? And my other question is, why do the two arms of the church in the East and the West not adopt these two codexes? All right? Okay, so there's three questions. All in Monte scholars probably won't see this anyway, but why is not one copy made of Codex Vaticanus in the Vatican Library or anywhere? Why isn't Codex Vaticanus an exemplar? Why is there no copies? Why isn't Codex Sinaiticus an exemplar? Why isn't copies of Sinaiticus found in St. Catherine's? Where it was actually there found. And why didn't the two arms of the church, the East and the West, not adopt these two codices? All right, then. I pray you've been blessed or edified by that. Um, Probably I didn't mean to use such harsh words. So I'll be more polite. But it's frustrating because these guys, I'm not a scholar, these guys are scholars, but James Snap talks about reasonable eclecticism. I'm saying even sometimes good old fashioned common sense. All right. And as a layperson, I expect more of scholars. Right. That's why I love the works of uh, Cowell. I love the works of James Royce. Alan Taylor Farnes. In fact, he went and did the work. Right. He didn't. He wasn't um, riding off what somebody else has said. He let me find evidence for myself. But it's disappointing with scholars that should know better argue based on who I know and this university I went to and um, uh, don't you know who I am? So it must be right. Believe me because I'm right. No, no, no. Get the evidence. Look at the scribal habits. Anyway, God bless you, may and pray God keep you, bless you and keep you, and may He cause His face to shine upon you. God bless you.